How peculiar the Christmas traditions seem. How many poisonings have been caused by an insufficiently thawed turkey? How many sixpences hidden in puddings to predict good fortune have become accidentally lodged in throats? How many house fires have been started when lighting the tree? I am sure a government department somewhere keeps score of such things. Then what to make of the Christmas ghost story, told always to chill our blood when we have gathered around the fireplace with the exact opposite intent? And what shall we say about the Christmas cracker, designed to promote concord between relatives and friends, while simulating a stick of dynamite? The story I am about to relate includes a Christmas cracker. It may also contain ghosts, but I think it is only fair that I let you be the judge. I say that because, as is often the way, I did not experience these events at first hand. The strange case of Peter Chance and the Christmas cracker was told to me by a writer, a fiction writer, though that ought not to prejudice you, and actually a well-known one. You might well have heard of her. In fact, I would be more surprised if you hadn't, for the lady in question was Amelia Cramphorne, the murder mystery author, who at that time lived in the same village as me, and still does. She no longer writes, sadly. She puts it down to arthritis in her wrists. She could use an amanuensis, of course, but doesn't. At the time this story takes place, she was at the height of her popularity, however, and very much a local celebrity around these parts, especially in the village, where she was treated like minor royalty, by which I mean she was kowtowed to, fawned over, and gossiped about in equal measure, and at all times besieged with requests to open this village fete or judge that vegetable-growing competition, and she acquiesced to most of these with good grace, even though I know she found a great deal of it immensely tiresome. She liked to throw a party, though. Indeed, her Christmas soirees had become something of a village tradition themselves, and as you might expect, to receive an invite to one of these glittering annual events was something special. It was a sign that you were somebody, or at least on the verge of becoming somebody. More importantly, it meant that you were part of Amelia's circle. I don't want you to think it was all about money and titles and that sort of thing, although obviously those things often do seem to go hand in hand. But Amelia had to like you or find you interesting in some way. The village has its share of crusty old colonels and decaying retired High Court judges, naturally, but Amelia would only invite people whose company and conversation she either knew and enjoyed, or people she liked the look of and wanted to know. And so it was that year, the year I'm telling you about. Most of the guests were regular fixtures at her do's. There was old Hardwick, a local colonel who was not crusty, and could be relied upon to regale the party with bawdy episodes from his military days, and delivered in a manner that suggested the teller was as outraged as the listener ought to be, despite the devilish glint in his eye. There was Nigel Palmer, a local artist who made wonderful paintings, birds mostly, although he could and did do portraits, but lived off the proceeds from commercial art. You may have seen his work for the milk people. He was there with his wife, Elspeth, who had been an actress on the stage, I think without any great success, but now involved herself with local amateur dramatics and all that entails. Then there was Cyril Parker, down from London, who furnished Amelia with gossip from the publishing world for as long as she furnished him with drink, and was famously good company, although the drink did for him in the end. There would have been Samantha Harrington, who wrote cookery books and recipes in magazines, and Gilbert Granger, the fashion photographer, and a few others I do not need to go into. You get the picture, I'm sure. But this year, Amelia had invited 2 further guests. A Miss Cecily Pinesmore, a local heiress and beauty, by all accounts, including Amelia's, very lovely and vivacious. She reminds me of me at that age, Amelia would say. No mean side to her, but seemingly perpetually unlucky in love. And then a Mr. Peter Chance, who was new in the village, and had already attracted a lot of interest from the females, who thought him rather dashing with his sports car, tailored suits, monogrammed cufflinks, easy charm and good looks, and attracted interest from the men, who thought him to be a conceited ass, apparently for precisely the same reasons. She invited Cecily because she happened to like her, and because, like many women of a certain age, she took a vicarious pleasure in attempting to steer the course of a younger woman's romantic life. I think she had come to think of Cecily as fruit withering on the vine, and that idea was somehow intolerable to her. It was precisely for that reason that she invited Mr. Chance, in the hope of engineering a love match between the 2 most eligible singletons in the village. I have already mentioned that Chance was considered dashing. It was said that he looked a little like Clark Gable, the American actor. Not that Amelia went to picture houses, mind. She found picture houses, and indeed the pictures in them, disagreeable, but the newspapers and magazines at the time were full of him, of course. I might say, aside from one or two exceptional occasions when the climate and other conditions were right, that she also found sex disagreeable. But she knew good form when she saw it, and Peter Chance she thought was just what the doctor ordered for young Cecily. I hope this doesn't seem unduly harsh of me, but I do wonder if there might be something in the psyche of novelists which makes them start to view people in their orbit as play pieces they can move around at will, like the characters in their stories. At any rate, she hoped to be the architect of both their futures. It was the Saturday evening before Christmas Day, and the party was in full swing. These were lavish gatherings, I suppose, but not stuffy or formal, even less so once libations had begun. The guests arrived to have their coats taken and a glass given. Then there was the catching up with old friends and introductions to new ones, with Amelia, perfect hostess, flitting in and out of conversations before everyone was finally called through to the dinner table. I won't go to town running through the menu. It has no bearing on our story that they had chopped liver pâté, oyster bisque topped with croutons and parsley, roasted turbot, filet mignon and all that. It was what happened at the dinner table that is important. As any writer will tell you, when entertaining non-writers, conversation often eventually turns to the business, the act, if you like, of writing, as it did on this occasion. Since Amelia wrote murder mysteries, her guests were always particularly interested in how she dreamt up the gruesome demises for her characters, whether she sometimes fantasized such demises for people in her real life, and whether those fantasies found their way into her books. "I can answer that," put in Cyril. "There's a certain literary critic for the New Statesman she's polished off in nearly every one of her last dozen stories." "Oh, Cyril," said Amelia, feigning injury. "I can't have people thinking I'm so thin-skinned as to let a couple of bad reviews upset me. Besides, only the last one was meant to be Neville. The others were from The Standard, The Spectator, The Daily Express." Then, almost inevitably, her guests quizzed her on whether they had or might turn up as characters in her books. And if so, would she cast them as murderer, suspect, or victim? Such exchanges as these run the risk of giving offence, of course, but I hope I have already made it apparent that this group, newcomers excepted, were on secure enough terms not to take offence quickly, or at the very least to save their complaints of such for the walk or cab ride home. "Dear Nigel is almost certainly a suspect, perhaps even a murderer," said Amelia. "Darling, don't look at me that way. It's that habit you have of lurking in the trees and bushes claiming to be painting birds. Why, only the other week you startled me down by the lake, bursting out of a thicket with your easel. But no," she continued, as the laughter died down, "you're much too sweet to be a murderer. Too obviously the solid, dependable type. Now your dreadful wife, on the other hand—" More laughter ensued. "What about me?" a sweet voice piped up. It was Cecily. She was seated, in accordance with Amelia's plans, next to Peter Chance, and Amelia had noticed that they had struck up a rapport with one another. Even now, as she spoke, Peter was watching her closely. His dark eyes kept dropping from her blue eyes to her slender neck, down to the exposed V of her cleavage and back, lingering always at that shapely neck, elongated since she wore her blonde hair in a chignon. "Murderer, suspect, or victim," said Cecily. Amelia grinned. "You know I adore you, Cecily," she said, "but you are really too lovely for words, and while your good looks could be perfectly deadly to the right man," her eyes swept over to Peter, "my publishers are always demanding beautiful corpses, so I'm afraid you are doomed to be the victim." Cecily was used to compliments and did not blush, but her elbows were on the table, her fingers interlaced, when she turned to her neighbour at the table and said, "And how about Mr. Chance here? He looks tailor-made for one of your books." He flashed his hostess a smile. "Yes, go on," he said. "What would you make me?" It is hard to describe, but Amelia remembers the question being met with an odd hush that temporarily fell on the assemblage. and as she considered her reply, she began to fancy there was something uncanny about the man. A sense that beneath the dark hair, dark eyes, and dark good looks was simply more darkness. And once perceiving this, even the perfect white of his smile was somehow dark, wolfish, predatory. As was her style, she dispelled the sudden unease with a wave of her hand and an off-handed riposte. "Come now, it's too easy. Tall, dark, handsome stranger. Murderer. 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 But I'd have to throw in a twist, otherwise where's the mystery? Now, Perkins, be a dear and top up everyone's drinks, won't you? I swear there are more refreshed people living in the Sahara." And so the courses were gone through, as were the libations, with the conversation returning to literature only once, and fleetingly, when Amelia repeated her assertion that fainting, as a physical, medically understood condition, did not exist, and the very notion of the fainting female was an invention of chauvinistic male authors who used it as a lazy narrative device to aid scene transitions. In keeping with previous years, the desserts were to be preceded by the pulling of Christmas crackers, but you should know that even to this standard festive custom Amelia had added a twist, or more accurately, a game. She ordered bespoke crackers through Lowell's in town, and had them made up so that each contained a particular motto and a particular gift. The little mottos, penned by Amelia herself, were each clues to the identity of a party guest, and the accompanying gifts, mere novelties of course, were then given to their intended recipients. It did not matter who pulled which cracker. Part of the fun was to hear the motto read aloud, and for everyone to guess who it was being guyed. A set of dinner plates was cleared, and before the next course came out, the crackers appeared, much to the slightly tipsy delight of all who remembered last year's hijinks. Nigel and Elspeth were the first to pull, and with the loud snap of the cracker, out fell the small piece of paper bearing the motto, the obligatory paper crown, and the trinket, in this case a keyring with a leather tag that was embossed with an address. Elspeth cleared her throat, she was a trained actress, remember, before reading aloud the motto. "The perfect gift for one who sups and becomes forgetful in his cups. The next time, when you're all at sea, you'll find the answer with your key." Doggerel, of course, but then Amelia never had any pretensions of being a poet. At any rate, the party instantly identified the target of the motto and the recipient of the gift as dear old Cyril. Famously, after moving to a swish new apartment, he had gotten so drunk that he had left the club not remembering his address and had spent a small fortune having a taxi drive him around London until he recognised his front door. This kind of thing always causes much mirth and animated chatter, and so the talk around the table got quite lively as the other crackers were pulled. I need not dwell on all of them, only on the cracker that was pulled by Peter and Cecily. As is sometimes the way when a recently acquainted man and woman have started to like one another and are obliged to do something of this ilk, they were a bit awkward about it, neither wanting to try too hard to win the pull, if you see what I mean. I suppose they may have felt a bit self-conscious, facing each other, pulling the thing, grimacing at the effort. And then something happened that almost never happens, I should think. The cracker split perfectly in the middle so that they were each left holding half of the cardboard tube. Out of her half, Cecily pulled a string of pearls. Not a real string of pearls, naturally. Just some plaster of Paris beads, I imagine. But again, as people do in these situations, she made a show of acting as if they were priceless jewels, holding them up to her throat and the like. Out of his half, Peter produced the folded-up piece of paper that bore the motto, and upon unravelling it, a queer expression came to his face. Amelia said he went a sickly green. I should point out that this was happening very quickly amid the general hubbub at the table. It was probably only Amelia who made anything of it, but the Colonel, sat next to Peter, was cajoling him to hurry up and read the damn motto, asking if the cat had got his bloody tongue and that sort of thing, and Peter was just shaking his head. In the end, the Colonel snatched the paper from him and read it out himself. "Here's a trinket and a tip, well timed to save your upper lip. It pays when playing Christmas games to keep your whiskers from the flames." Colonel Hardwicke had started chuckling before he reached the end of the rhyme, since it was clearly a reference to himself. The Colonel had an impressive salt and pepper moustache that had caught fire at both ends during a game of Snapdragon at last year's festivities, much to everyone's amusement. "Very droll," he said. "But what the devil am I supposed to do with a string of pearls? You've rather dropped the ball with this one, Amelia, old horse." Then he caught sight of Cecily, who, having shifted in her seat, now presented her back to Peter, and, reaching her left hand behind her head, delicately raised the chignon for him to fasten the fake pearls around her neck. "Never mind," said the Colonel. "They look better on Miss Pinesmore anyway." But Amelia noticed that Peter's hands were trembling as he fastened the catch. She had seen the expression on his face when he first looked at the motto, and determined to steal a look at the discarded paper herself as soon as she was able. In the end, however, she never did. The business with the Christmas cracker was quite quickly forgotten once the party moved from the dinner table to the drawing room, and Peter Chance seemed to recover himself. Amelia, too, chided herself for her sudden qualms about him. He seemed confident and self-assured, but looks could be deceiving, she reasoned. Perhaps he had experienced a bout of shyness, being placed at a table among this company of outspoken, boisterous personalities, who were, after all, relative strangers to him, and possibly this accounted for his reticence in reading out the motto. Besides, Cecily was clearly enamoured of Peter, and the pair were pretty much glued to one another's sides all evening. As the party drew to its close and guests began to make their way into the night, Cecily sidled up to Amelia, grinning from ear to ear. "I say, Amelia, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for inviting Peter. He's an absolute sweetheart," she gushed. "He asked me to go for a walk around the lake tomorrow afternoon, and do you know, I think I said yes." The author smiled. "Darling, that's wonderful news. Enjoy yourselves. I'm sure you will. Be careful," she said, adding a note of caution. "Not of Peter, but of all the jealous women in the village who are going to have their knives out for you from now on." Cecily rolled her eyes. "He is terribly handsome, though. He has a look of... what's that chap's name? Clark Gable, the actor." "Oh, Cecily," said Amelia, coyly. "You know I don't know films." The proposed rendezvous by the lake never happened, however. At least not when it was supposed to. Amelia was sitting quietly, apparently in deep thought, because she jumped at the sound of the telephone ringing. She took the receiver and found Cecily on the other end, quite upset because she had been stood up. "I went to meet him, as we'd planned, and when I got to the lake where the little jetty is, as we'd agreed, he was nowhere to be seen. So I waited and waited until I began to feel stupid, and then I wondered if I'd got things in a muddle. So I went to call for him at his house, and his maid answered the door, and she said not only that he wasn't there, but he hadn't been there all day, and in fact they hadn't seen him since yesterday. And when I told her he must be there, she said it was none of her business, but the master does have a habit of disappearing, and well, now I don't know whether to be worried or cross, Amelia. What if something awful's happened?" Amelia naturally offered the usual consolations. He was sure to be fine. There was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation, but her qualms about Chance began to resurface as she recalled his queer behaviour at the dinner table. The telephone conversation between them persisted for far longer than is reasonable to recount here, but by the end of it, Amelia had made up her mind that Peter Chance was indeed a terrible cad, and despite making the appropriate placatory noises for Cecily's sake, he was bound to turn up soon, etc., she privately hoped he'd driven that damn sports car of his into a ditch. I should explain that, like many writers of murder mysteries, Amelia fancied herself at least half as clever as the detectives in her stories. So after saying goodbye to Cecily, her resolve to look at Chance's motto assumed a fresh urgency, and she went to find the maid. Clearing away the evidence of the previous night's revelry had been the order of the morning, and of course the table had long since been cleared, but Amelia hoped she might be able to see the discarded cracker mottos before they were properly disposed of. What most perplexed her, I suppose, was that she had heard the mottos for the other guests being read out, but not one for Chance, and she found she couldn't even remember what the motto ought to have said. She did not think she had asked for pearls either, but Chance had behaved queerly when he first looked at that slip of paper. Any hope she had of looking at it herself was, however, quickly extinguished. "Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Amelia, all the party hats and crackers and things went on the fire," said the maid. "Oh, it never entered my mind that you want to keep 'em. I hope I haven't been too hasty." Amelia assured the girl she was not in trouble, even if she couldn't quite keep the note of impatience out of her voice. Another course of action quickly suggested itself as Amelia planned to attend to some business in town the next day, and it would not be too much of an inconvenience to stop off at Lowell's and ask Mr. Lowell to retrieve a copy of her original order for the box of crackers. Therein would be her instructions in full, including the typed mottos she had provided at the time. What could be simpler? The next day came, and Amelia strode out, purposeful, obviously, impeccably dressed, naturally, the gleaming motor car wheeled out of the garage and waiting. Sometimes she preferred to give her driver the day off, and this was one such occasion. Town is 3.5 miles away, and was very busy as one expects in the run-up to Christmas. The wet streets bustled with people buying last-minute gifts, fretting over potential but unlikely food shortages, and trying their best to keep cheerful, even if the dank drizzle of the day was hardly festive. Everyone being grimly preoccupied with their own pressing concerns, the famous author was able to press ahead with hers, for once, uninterrupted. The shop bell chimed as she stepped out of the rain and into Lowell's. Mr. Lowell, purveyor of luxury goods, as it said on the sign outside, was behind the counter, exactly where she expected him to be. Purveyor was the right term, for Mr. Lowell did not make anything in his shop, and indeed his shop carried very limited stock. Mostly biscuits and other confections, some toiletries and perfumes, fancy stationery, and the small items of furniture and objets d'art in his window had barely changed over the last few years, but he had contacts at home and overseas, and was able to obtain the kind of things well-off people desire, but which can be difficult to obtain anywhere outside London, including custom-made Christmas crackers. "Miss Cramphorne, how delightful to see you," he beamed. And whether it was just force of habit that made him rub his hands together, I could not say. "I trust your Christmas soiree was a success?" An idea occurred to him. "Did everything go with the requisite bang?" he asked. "Yes, thank you," said Amelia, removing her gloves as she spoke. "But it's in relation to the party and the Christmas crackers that I've come to see you." The shopkeeper frowned. "Oh, I hope you found them to your satisfaction, Miss Cramphorne. Do you know they're made for me by a chap in London, in Chinatown? Well, they're usually very good with anything explosive," he said, but he was evidently lining up a scapegoat. "I was more than satisfied with the decibel level," said Amelia, "but I should have had some moustache scissors among the novelties which weren't there, and I don't remember asking for a string of pearls which were, and I'm not sure the mottos were all quite present and correct. Mr. Lowell, would it be possible to check the order, please? Just so I can reassure myself I'm not losing my mind." Mr. Lowell frowned even harder, but said, "Yes, I'll just check for you now, Miss Cramphorne. 2 shakes." At one end of the counter was a wooden cabinet containing numerous little drawers, labelled in a manner that must have been sensible to the shopkeeper, but to Amelia was arcane. It was to this he went and began ferreting for the relevant paperwork. At the other end of the counter was a door that had to lead to some sort of back room or private store, and it was to this door that Amelia's attention was diverted. For Amelia had become suddenly aware of noises from behind the door, noises that suggested a third presence in the shop. It was possible that Mr. Lowell had some help she did not know about, perhaps a delivery boy to cope with the extra busy Christmas period. But the sounds emanating from the hidden room were unusual, to say the least. It sounded like rattling chains, and, almost inaudible, a low muttering or moaning as of someone in a state of pained delirium, and something else. "Have you got someone helping you today, Mr. Lowell?" asked Amelia. "Eh?" said the shopkeeper, hunched over a drawer packed tightly with papers. "Is there someone with you in the shop at the moment?" she said. "I fancy I hear someone in your back room there." He straightened and pushed the drawer shut, but remained with his back to her for a few awkward seconds, as if he needed to compose himself before turning to address her. "Mice, I shouldn't wonder," he said, tugging at the bottom of his waistcoat, patting his jacket pockets, and fussing with his tie in a swift succession of nervous habits. "Or worse. All the stores have them. Towns just the same as cities. I know some say it's cruel, but I put poison down to be on the safe side." "But I heard someone spit," she began, before correcting herself. "I heard someone." Mr. Lowell swallowed. "My sister," he blurted. "She's not been well." Amelia looked back at the closed door, then back at Mr. Lowell. "Your sister's in your back room?" "No, she's in her bedroom," he explained. "But she's really quite sick, and I'm sorry to say it's been very stressful trying to run the business while also attending to her needs." "I can imagine," said Amelia, "but I don't understand what this has to do with my crackers." "No," said Lowell. "You're quite right. It's unacceptable, unforgivable, and inexcusable, but I seem to have mislaid your order form, Miss Cramphorne. I'm sure I can get to the bottom of the confusion if I could just have a word with my Chinese associate in London. Unfortunately, he comes and goes. Please, if you'll just give me some time." Amelia could feel herself becoming irked by this obvious prevarication. Worse, she could feel herself flushing. The shop's aroma of sugary sweets and floral soaps was sickly. The heavy purple drapes that covered the walls, intended to create a warm, opulent intimacy, along with the profusion of dark-leaved aspidistras sprouting from scattered dark pots, now seemed to be closing in all around her. This, combined with the shopkeeper's peculiar attitude, began to oppress her. She knew she must leave immediately. "Thank you, Mr. Lowell. Find out what you can," she said, and dashed out into the sleet. As I mentioned, Amelia had other business in town that day. It is irrelevant what. But attending to the third or fourth bit of business, she realized she had mislaid her gloves. Her heart sank, not because they were favourite gloves and irretrievably lost, but because she knew quite well that she had taken them off in Lowell's and placed them on the counter. You already know that Amelia was no shrinking violet, so it will not surprise you that she reprimanded herself for being so easily spooked before, and trudged back through the increasingly bedraggled crowds to Lowell's. What I am now about to relate is exactly what Amelia told me, and is strange, even if it is not yet the strangest part of the story. For when she re-entered the shop, she noticed instantly that it was changed. The bell still clanged, but it had lost its lively timbre. Those dark drapes that had seemed to close in on her before still hung there, but as mouldering shrouds concealing cracked and clammy plaster. There was no Mr. Lowell behind the counter to greet her, and indeed the counter was thick with dust, cobweb, and from the back room she heard again the sound of rattling chains, cracked, confused murmurs, and a sound she now placed and should have placed before, a typewriter, or rather the sound of its keys being struck one at a time. Grimly, she thought of Lowell's sick sister typing her last will and testament. Amelia went to the door and tried the handle, only to find it infuriatingly locked. Feeling excited and foolish even as she did so, she fell into a crouch that brought her eye level with the keyhole, and leaning closer, peered through into the dim space beyond. To her astonishment and repulsion, she could now see the typewriter she heard, set on a wooden table, and operating it, an old woman. But although the woman was ancient and dressed in the decayed remnants of what must once have been a fine gown, that was not what was horrifying about the scene. For as the woman was working the typewriter, she too was being worked by heavy metal chains suspended from above that raised her limp hands up and down to clumsily bash the typewriter keys, as if she was a grotesque, life-size marionette made of flesh and bone. She could only just make this out through the keyhole, for the light was poor, and it was unclear from this low angle who or what was pulling the chains that pulled the woman's arms. But she could hardly believe what she saw. Her heart was pounding, her mouth dry. She wanted to scream, but for some reason the sound would not come. Then, suddenly, she started. A dark shape passed in front of the keyhole, obscuring her sight. There was someone else behind the door. In fright, she reeled backwards, stood up, and turned in a rush, and found her path immediately blocked by another. This time she did scream. "Oh, good heavens! I didn't mean to startle you," said a familiar voice. In her flight from the door, Amelia had collided with Mr. Lowell, who had presently entered, and, with his return, had evidently returned the shop to its habitual state. He had instinctively reached out to steady her, and his hands now held her arms. Flustered, Understandably, but recognizing the transformation that had occurred around her, Amelia struggled to find the right words. An unhappy but sadly not uncommon condition that afflicts all writers from time to time, but to which she was not generally accustomed. Instead, her eyes flashed to his shop counter, pristine again. "My gloves," she eventually found herself saying. "I think I must have—" Mr. Lowell relaxed his grip on her, and he reached into his mackintosh, producing the gloves. "I noticed them shortly after you left," he said. "I couldn't stomach the thought of you out there in the perishing cold, so I rushed out after you." "Thank you, Mr. Lowell," said Amelia. She gathered herself and her gloves, and made to exit. "I just wanted to apologize again for the mix-up with the Christmas crackers," the shopkeeper began in his usual obsequious manner. "Rest assured, Miss Cramphorne, I shan't sleep until I have put things right." She paused in the doorway, recalling the vision of the wizened creature in the back room that disturbed her still. Even now she was sure it had been a bizarre hallucination. "Put things right," she found herself echoing. Yes. Then she thanked him and went. She remained in an unsettled, pensive frame of mind for the rest of the day. The early winter darkness found her sat quietly in her study, unable to follow the convolutions of a friend's novel, unable even to follow the lines on the page. She was not dozing, but she was elsewhere when the telephone suddenly rang. The violent jangle shattered the dim silence like a brick through a window. "Hello?" It was, it happens, the first of 2 telephone calls she received that evening. I shall do my best to report only the salient parts of both. "Hello, Amelia, it's me, Cecily. I've had some tremendous news." Her young friend spoke rapidly and excitedly, and Amelia found she had to make some physical or mental adjustment to focus, almost in the way one tunes a radio. But she caught the gist, and it was this. Peter Chance had been in touch. He had apologized profusely for standing her up, but explained that he had been, in his words, unexpectedly pulled away. A business matter, she thought, and it had proved almost impossible to get in touch because he was abroad. But he was coming back and had asked to see her the day after Boxing Day because he had something very important to show her. "Oh, Amelia," Cecily had said, "you don't suppose he's going to do something hideous like produce an engagement ring, do you?" She had barely put down the telephone when it rang again. This time it was Mr. Lowell speaking. "I hope you don't mind me calling so late in the day," he said. "I would have tried you before, but unfortunately my sister's condition has deteriorated somewhat." "Oh?" said Amelia. "I trust she is comfortable now." "Well, no and yes," the man replied. "I'm afraid she's dead, Miss Cramphorne." "Oh dear," said Amelia, adding redundantly, "and at Christmas, too." "Yes," said Mr. Lowell, "but she had been very poorly." A short silence followed before Lowell began again in a brighter tone. "In rather happier news, I think I can solve part of the mystery surrounding your cracker order." The shopkeeper explained that he had received a call from an upset customer, complaining because the rings and mirrors and combs and necklaces she had ordered in her Christmas crackers had been missing. She was a bit embarrassed, as it was an all-female party, and one of her guests, a lady of somewhat, shall we say, hirsute persuasion, received a set of beard and moustache scissors. "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure I understand," said Amelia. "Well, it seems to me that this lady ended up with your scissors, and you ended up with her string of pearls," Mr. Lowell replied. "A terrible mix-up has occurred. I was unable to reach my Chinese associate, but I did get hold of his nephew, and I asked him to double-check the original order as soon as possible. Miss Cramphorne, I am dreadfully sorry that this has happened, and I have taken the liberty of arranging a luxury hamper to be delivered tomorrow as a gesture of goodwill." She made the usual half-hearted gestures of protestation. "Oh, that's not really necessary, but very kind of you, etc." Then she offered her condolences once more, and the call ended with the customary Christmas tidings. Amelia breathed a heavy sigh of relief. The news of positive developments in Cecily and Peter's romance, and the confirmation of some irksome but harmless blunder with the crackers, combined to lift her out of what she now realized had been a funk. It dawned on her that she had become unused to things progressing in ways contrary to her wishes, and the events of the past few days had upset her more profoundly than they should have. It also dawned on her that this aspect of herself, this desire for control, was something she ought to keep in check. It was not healthy to be so confounded by life's inevitable ups and downs, she reasoned, and recalled again the hallucination she had suffered in Mr. Lowell's shop, which she now realized was a manifestation of acute psychological distress. Nevertheless, she went to bed with the smug feeling of the natural equilibrium having been restored. She was like that, you see. She believed that there was a course to be steered. I was unsure whether there was a course or indeed anything to steer with. That was one of the major differences between us. To me, everything was random, mere chance, if you'll excuse the pun. To me, the opposite, whatever it is, has always seemed too terrifying for words. Christmas Day came and went in its usual whirlwind way. Bleary but good-natured Boxing Day followed. Then came the day after that, with people gradually emerging from their still warm living rooms to feel the crisp winter air on their faces and to blow away the cobwebs. Amelia was out for a stroll, in good spirits, nodding and returning the copious felicitations she received from reverent passing villagers. Before long she ran into Colonel Hardwick and they exchanged the customary post-Christmas chat. How was yours? Lovely, thank you. How about you? What have you got planned for New Year's? You know, the sort of thing. Then, what a good party it was at Amelia's last Saturday, and how the Colonel had felt a bit fragile in the church on Sunday, and then... Queer business with old Chance and the crackers, though. How so? Asked Amelia. She had rather put it to the back of her mind. I thought you must have noticed it too, said the Colonel. How Chance had pulled the cracker with Cecily and then made a god-awful fuss about reading the motto. If you remember, I ended up reading it, and it was about me singeing my moustache last year. Well, I'm not sure why, but I must have absent-mindedly put that bit of paper in my pocket. Well, I found it the other day when I was sending it off to be cleaned, and I'm not sure how I missed it at the time, but there was something printed on the other side. Amelia remembers going cold when he said this. What did it say? She asked, in a weak voice. It didn't say anything, replied Colonel Hardwick. It was a picture. Tiny, of course, but unmistakable. I must say I wondered what you were thinking of, eh? I know you've got a taste for the macabre, but it seemed jolly harsh on Peter. And the girl, for that matter. He must have intuited her confusion because he rummaged in his coat and produced the scrap of paper. And as he had stated, there was indeed a picture, tiny but detailed, and depicting unmistakably a man garrotting a woman with a string of pearls. And unmistakably, the man was Peter Chance, for he was wearing Chance's peaked cap, and at the wrist of the hand pulling the necklace taut, the monogrammed cufflink. The look on his face was one of pure anger, the teeth bared in a wolfish snarl. The next moments were a blur. Amelia could not account for the awful image on the paper, but nor could she ignore this terrible portent. She remembered Peter and Cecily's plans to meet that day by the lake. She remembered his hands trembling at the party as he clasped the fake beads around Cecily's slender neck. Leaving the Colonel standing slack-jawed in the street, she commandeered the vicar's bicycle and raced to the lake. It took her a matter of mere minutes, but somehow the light was already going when she reached the wooden gate, the one that opened out onto the lakeside path. The water looked tar-black and eerily still. Even on the bleakest of days you might find walkers, but today all was quiet, almost as if she was the first to cross the threshold into an undiscovered, uninhabited, unimagined place. She called out Cecily's name. She was walking the path which went around the lake. She could have gone left or right. She chose left for a reason about which she could not be sure. It soon became evident to her that she was quite alone here. She called out Cecily's name again and felt suddenly foolish. The only reply was the hiss of the trees and bushes that seemed to chide her. Birds and animals, invisible but apparent from their calls and scurrying, chided her too. She had started to relax a little, begun to construct in her mind rational explanations for the picture on the motto, and even to imagine a happy ending. She was picturing churches and wedding dresses when she followed the path around a bend and was stopped in her tracks. There, in front of her, was Cecily. She was alone, but she was moving mechanically from side to side, with her hands clutching at her throat, and she was opening and closing her mouth, fish-like, as if struggling to speak or gasping for air. And then, as Amelia wondered what on earth was happening, Cecily moved a hand away from her throat to reveal the pearl necklace wrapped tightly around it. She reached for Amelia with outstretched arm and fingers splayed. "Cecily!" Amelia cried. "What are you doing? Please stop it at once!" She went to shake the girl to her senses, then saw something that halted her a second time. Cecily was not strangling herself, if such a thing is even possible. Amelia saw now that both ends of the string were visible on either side of her head, and were being pulled taut, as if gripped by unseen hands. And shockingly, Amelia noticed that the girl was being raised in some way, forcibly lifted off the ground, for only the tips of her shoes were in contact with the earth, digging and scraping into the mud as she struggled. It was quite impossible, of course, but Amelia charged forward to attack the invisible assailant with the only weapon she had to hand, her handbag. She struck about the air, about where you would imagine the head to be, and according to her telling of it, made contact with something. But it was all, sadly, too late. The girl suddenly tumbled, the string of pearls unravelling as she fell, then dropping into the dirt alongside her, those horrible abrasions on the slender neck, the lovely eyes wide with fright, the blonde hair spilling out like a slick of honey on a floor of dark, rotting leaves. A beautiful corpse, Amelia couldn't keep from thinking. Then, much to her eternal embarrassment, she fainted. I suppose things could have gone quite badly for Amelia after that. Luckily, Nigel Palmer, the artist, had been doing one of his bird pictures in the woods over on the other side of the lake, and had emerged from the thicket onto the path just in time to see the confrontation. It was quite clear to him that whatever had happened, Amelia had been trying to prevent it, and was not the cause of it, and so Amelia was in the clear. The eventual verdict was that Cecily had committed suicide. What else could it have been? Naturally, a famous person being involved with something like that caused a bit of a stir. It was too much to expect the newspaper chaps to overlook that here was a woman who made her living out of death and murder, seemingly living out one of her own plots. That always seemed rather silly to me, because, of course, it was nothing like anything she would have come up with. Too many loose ends. As it happens, I can tie up a few of them for you. A postscript, you might call it. Amelia pretty much gave up writing her books after that. She blamed bad wrists, but I think she just lost the taste for it somehow. She would still have friends at Christmas, but the parties were never quite the same, much to her regret. And she never ordered crackers from Mr. Lowell again, much to Mr. Lowell's regret. Not too long afterwards, there was an explosion at a shop in Soho that made fireworks and the like, and everyone died. The police said it was probably an insurance job gone wrong. I expect you think I'm going to end by saying that from Mr. Peter Chance nothing was ever heard again. And there you would be only half correct. For not too long after the dreadful business at the lake, the wreck of a sports car was discovered somewhere along the Amalfi coast, apparently having been driven off a cliff and smashing into rocks half a dozen times on its way down. Whoever found it got a nasty shock because there was a person at the steering wheel, looking much the worse for wear, of course. The local police investigated and eventually declared the charred, broken body to be that of the missing Englishman, Peter Chance, last seen at Amelia's Christmas bash, having apparently left the country and never returned, despite whatever was said in his telephone call to Cecily. Some of the Italians remembered a rich Anglese turning up in the area just before Christmas, mooching about, they said, in shops and bars and restaurants, talking to himself like an idiot, though I expect that may have been a bit of jealousy or prejudice coming out. Whatever really went on, they only found the driver. Chance had evidently been alone in the vehicle. But, curiously, you might say, they did find something else, strewn throughout the car, but mostly gathered in the footwell of the passenger seat, was a cluster of blackened pearls. Today's story was Chance's Motto by Jasper Lestrange. It was read by Jasper Lestrange. If you enjoy the show, why not become a patron on Patreon and gain access to exclusive content? It's the surest way to help me keep creating. You can also buy me a coffee, like, subscribe, comment, share, follow on social media, and read the description for more information about the show and how you can engage with it. Until next time, sweet dreams.
"Come in,"
he said.
"Come into the light."
Join me on Patreon for stories like this.
"Aye," he replied. "The oldest show on earth. All about a murder and a hanging. It's queer how folks likes a murder, even if it's only old Punch knocking Judy's brains out with his stick."
And stories like this.
"Beyond this are the private apartments, and I ask you all to remove your shoes." Then she smiled a little and added, "Or other footwear."
And this.
As I was getting up to speed, I heard the pad of feet and a snarling behind me. The next moment, the heavy bulk of a big animal caught me broadside on and nearly unseated me.
Show your support for the channel and join me on Patreon.
Those who would prefer not to do so may sit on the seats and wait here.
Read the video description for more information.